Thank you. On behalf of the Pew Research Center, we are honored to present to you today the story of trust in the United States as told through survey research and public opinion data. Many of you are closely involved in your communities in building trust. For the next hour, we invite you to go on a journey with us. Zoom out with us and think about how your experiences do or don't map on to some of the trends we're seeing in the data. We're going to talk to you about how trust is changing over time in the United States. We'll get into how trust is geographically distributed and how it varies among various groups. We'll get into some of the other social and political changes that are also happening in the country, and those are part and parcel of what's happening with trust. And then finally, we'll look at what the data can tell us about the future of trust in the United States. Jenn very kindly introduced us already, but in case you forgot, I'm Neha Sahgal. I'm the Vice President for Research.
And I'm Laura Silver. I'm an Associate Director for Research. Before I get started, a quick note about our methodology. Everything we're going to be showing you today is drawn from nationally representative surveys. If you have questions about our methodology, we're happy to speak about it in the fireside chat, but we're also really pleased to announce that our methodology and a full report about this is now available online. We'll have a QR code for it at the end. But let's start talking about the state of trust in America. What you're looking at here is data drawn from the General Social Survey, one of the highest quality, long-running surveys available in the United States that's asked in a consistent way and with a consistent question over time about social trust. And what you can see here is that the share of Americans who say that most people can be trusted fell from 46% in the 1970s to 34% in 2018. There was a corresponding rise in the other side of the question, which is you can't be too careful when dealing with people. When we replicated this question in 2023 and 2024, we found an identical share of Americans who said most people can be trusted.
Different groups experience trust differently. And if you are to consider trust a social good, which I assume many of you think of trust as a social good, then it would be fair to say that this social good, not unlike other social goods in the United States today, it's unequally distributed. And the axes along which trust differs resemble many of the other axes of division in the US today. Trust can vary by age, by socioeconomic status, or by a person's race or ethnicity. But I want to begin with partisanship. Democrats are somewhat more likely than Republicans to say most people can be trusted. There is a gap, but it's not a very big one, and this is an important point. In public opinion research today, it's so common for us to see the vast majority of Democrats on one side of an issue and an equally large share of Republicans on exactly the opposite side of the same issue. Partisan gaps can often feel like chasms, but that is not the case here. There is a gap, it's not a very big one. Similarly, when it comes to gender differences in trust, men are somewhat more trusting than women, but again, it's not a huge gap. Now, here's one that really matters: age. We find that younger people in the United States today are much less trusting than older people. So I know what some of you are thinking, right? Could this be a life cycle change, right? As you age, maybe you become more trusting, you realize you actually need other people, or could it be that there's something happening with the generations? I'm going to ask you to hold that thought. We're going to come back to this later in the presentation. We are finding in the data that the age differences in trust that we're seeing are not just about life cycle changes. Socioeconomic status matters. People who are less well educated and who earn less are much less trusting. I think it would be fair to say that if you have a safety net, then you have less to lose if you misplace your trust. And the story of trust in the United States is intertwined with the story of race in the United States. We find that Black and Hispanic adults are much less trusting than Asian and white adults. And this relationship between race and trust holds even after we account for differences by income, differences by education, partisanship, all of those other things that we know are wrapped up with race in our country today. A person's experience with discrimination or their experience as part of the collective history of a group shapes the way they think about other people.
Related to how trust is distributed across different groups, we also find that trust is distributed differently across the country. Because of the survey I mentioned and the size of it, which was our single largest survey conducted in the United States at around 37,000 people, we can actually look at how trust varies across states in the US as well as across 34 of our largest cities. And what you see is that trust varies quite a bit. We have certain states that stand out for a relatively high level of trust. You see in Oregon, Utah, and New Hampshire, nearly half of people say most people can be trusted, above the national average. On the other side of the coin, you see in places in the Southeast and in West Virginia, much lower levels of trust, around a quarter of people saying most people can be trusted. But even if you zoom in on a given state, for example, California, trust can vary quite a bit across metropolitan areas. San Francisco stands out as one of the most trusting places in our country, and Riverside, one of the least trusting urban areas. But let's talk about why that might be. Zooming in on San Francisco, one of the things that we know about it is it's characterized by also having one of the highest shares of education in the country. It stands out for having some of the highest college attainment of any of our metropolitan areas. On the other hand, in Riverside, many fewer people have a postgraduate degree or a college degree. And the two cities differ in other meaningful ways related to what Neha was just presenting. They differ when it comes to their income levels, they differ on race, and they differ on age, all of which are related to social trust. But there's something more to it than that. So you might be thinking, of course, so when you have maybe more affluent or more educated cities or cities that are characterized by more white or Asians, maybe you would see higher levels of trust. And that is some of it, maybe even a lot of it. It's what we would talk about as a compositional effect. But there's more to it from our data. What we actually find is there's an independent effect of who you live around. Let me explain that in more detail. Let's say I took Neha. I took all of her attributes. I took her gender, her age, her degree. I took Neha from a neighborhood that had very few college graduates who lived around her, and I moved her to a neighborhood with a lot of college graduates around her. What we would anticipate is that her probability of trusting would increase by 7 percentage points. So keeping her education level and all of the other factors about her the same, we would anticipate living in a more educated neighborhood would have an independent impact on her trust levels. This is kind of a virtuous circle type of thing. Who you live around seems to play a role in how trusting you are. And our data is suggestive of other impacts from the neighborhood level. We know, for example, that people who think that their neighborhood is characterized by having a lot of opportunities, for example, job opportunities, tend to be more trusting. People who think their neighborhoods are less safe, or who think that their neighborhood has a great deal of issues when it comes to drugs or other kind of social issues in their neighborhoods, are less trusting. We also know that people tend to be more trusting if they think their neighbors are more similar to them. People who think that their neighbors share certain attributes with them, whether that be racially and ethnically, educationally, or in terms of their partisanship, are more likely to trust their neighbors. So thinking that you're around like people seems to be contributing to trust as well.
I really wish that I could answer this question for you in a parsimonious way, fix this one thing and you will fix trust. But the data, unfortunately, will not support such a conclusion. What I can tell you is that trust is swimming in the same water with a number of other social and political changes that are also happening in the United States today. And at the Pew Research Center, we have been tracking some of these changes since the 1990s. So let's talk about our politics first. Politics in the United States today is characterized by political polarization. What do I mean by that? Democrats and Republicans don't agree on much. And what's more, they don't seem to like each other very much. In the 1990s, when we were conducting public opinion polling up until almost present day, we've been seeing that a rising share of Republicans are saying they have a very unfavorable view of the Democratic Party. And similarly, for their part, a rising share of Democrats are saying they have a very unfavorable view of the Republican Party. We've seen a rise in the share of both Democrats and Republicans who say that the other party is a threat to the country. This is what we call partisan antipathy, and it's on the rise. We also don't seem to agree on much. In the 1990s, the median Democrat and the median Republican did disagree on quite a few things, but we actually found they agreed on a lot as well. That all started changing. Right? In 2014, we repeated our study of political polarization, and we found that Democrats and Republicans had moved further apart. They agreed on less. And not only did they move apart on the issues, they also seemed to distance from each other emotionally and physically. They don't want their kids marrying into the other family. And increasingly, they're living in neighborhoods where they're putting up yard signs, and it's the exact same yard sign as everybody else. We have distanced from each other politically in America today. At any given time, half the country doesn't have much in common with the other half. They don't like each other very much, and it stands to reason that they don't trust each other very much.
Another major change we've been documenting throughout our surveys has to do with the rising use of the internet as well as social media. We've been asking a question over time about the share of people who use the internet, and you can see that back in 2000, it was around half of Americans, and by later in the decades, it rose to almost everyone saying that they used the internet. In fact, it rose so dramatically we had to change our question. We couldn't just ask, do you use the internet, or even do you use it daily? We had to ask if you use it almost constantly, and you can see that large shares of Americans say that's the case. But how might this affect social trust? I think all of us can understand that the way we use the internet and the way we use social media could have a bearing on how we interact with those around us. I am guilty of sometimes looking at my phone and not communicating with those around me, walking around with my earbuds in, maybe being in my own little ecosystem. And I think that's true of a lot of people. In fact, our data bears that out. Scholars have also argued that using social media can affect people's mental health because they're staying in, they're focused on their phones, they're connecting in different ways, and they're not connecting interpersonally. That's not necessarily the whole story because our data also shows positives that can come from interacting digitally, but it's certainly a major change in how we interact with others, and insofar as that could be changing how we trust others, it's an important thing to consider.
The digital revolution changed the way we get news. According to Pew Research Center surveys, a rising share of Americans are getting their news from social media, and this is particularly true for young adults. Social media can be highly personalized. By their own admission, people tell us that it is difficult to tell fact from fiction on social media. Misinformation is a very big problem for the country. We no longer trust that our fellow Americans are operating on the basis of the same set of facts, and that erodes trust.
Another major change that American society has undergone in recent decades has to do with the changing face of America, the growing racial and ethnic diversity. In 1960, according to the Census Bureau, you see that around 8 in 10 Americans were white. By 2023, it was closer to 6 in 10, and our projections suggest that by 2060, it'll be 45% white. How is this related to social trust? Well, one thing we know, and that scholars have found, is that homogeneity can be related to trust. Some of this is related to the type of data that academics are relying on. Some of the most trusting places in the world are places like the Nordic countries, which are also characterized by relative homogeneity. But scholars have also found that interpersonal interactions with people who are different can also affect people's trust levels. And we know, as I mentioned earlier, that when people think they're surrounded by those who are like them, they're more likely to trust those people. So as America has diversified, this may be playing a role in how Americans are trusting those around them. But we have other axes of diversity as well. We at the Pew Research Center have also been tracking religious diversity and religious change over time. What you're looking at here is the share of Americans who identify as Christian, as well as the rising line, the share of Americans who identify as religiously unaffiliated. That is, they say that they're atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. How might this be related to social trust? I assume many of you are familiar with the social capital literature, the idea of bowling alone, the idea that turning out and turning up at different events and participating in your local community is related to trust. As America becomes less religiously observant, people are also attending services less. Our data suggest that people who turn up to religious services in person are more likely to trust others. There is not a relationship between praying more often and trusting others more, or between saying that religion is important in your lives and trusting others. The relationship really comes from turning up, from going, from meeting, from being. So we've talked to you about a number of ways in which American society is changing. We're becoming more diverse religiously. We're becoming more diverse racially. We're finding echo chambers if we want them, or pursuing our cultural niches because we can tune into what we want when it comes to media, tune into what we want when it comes to social media. What this means is that America's challenge when it comes to building and sustaining trust necessarily involves dealing with the heterogeneity of our country. We are not homogeneous, and we're kind of not homogeneous across any of the different dimensions that we spoke to you about. But what we know from our politics literature is that if we end up cleaving apart into an us versus them, if we end up kind of focusing on our difference, this is not a recipe for building and sustaining trust.
All of those changes in the way that we worship, the way that we get our news, means that younger generations are coming of age in a world that's different from that of their parents or that of their grandparents. So remember how I talked about some of the age differences in trust? Let's come back to that point. We find in the data that every subsequent generation is less trusting than the one before it. So this is a complicated chart. Let me walk you through it. Say you were born in the 1960s. That's the light blue line right there in the middle, right? Your level of trust over the course of your lifespan will still be higher than somebody who was born in the 1980s or the 1990s. As older generations are supplanted by younger generations, we become less trusting as a country.
Okay, so we have talked to you a lot about the state of trust in America, who trusts, where they trust, what sorts of things are related to trust. But you might be thinking, how does abstract trust, trust in most people, pertain to people's day-to-day lives, and how does it matter? So we want to invite you to get out your phones because we're going to do some audience participation and speak about the ways in which social trust might manifest in day-to-day behaviors. So please take a picture of this QR code. You should see a poll. On the left, you might see Q&A. On the right, you'll see poll. Make sure it's highlighted to poll because we're about to advance a slide and ask you to fill out our first question. Okay, let's go with the first. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm standing in front of your QR code. I apologize.
Let's get out of the way. Realize the irony of this. We just talked about phones and trust. So.
We should have worn like QR code dresses to get ready.
Next time. Remember that next time, Laura. All right, we're looking around to see if everybody's sort of with us.
Yeah.
Nod your head if you are.
Okay.
I'm seeing some thumbs up. All right, Laura, first question.
First question. So well, you're going to get the answers and the question at the same time for us. Do you have any neighbors you would feel comfortable asking to keep a set of keys? Wow, okay, it's still ticking up. Fantastic. You are a trusting bunch. I'll let the last ones come in, but we are hovering around 8 and 10. So this is fantastic. I am not surprised that people out there building trust are also trusters. But let me tell you, that does not match the American public. So 8 and 10 of you seem to have someone you can rely on. 59% of Americans do overall. But what's important about this is that people who have social trust are much more likely to also have this relationship with their neighbors and to have someone they can rely on. It's 20 percentage points higher among social trusters than non-trusters that they can have someone to leave their keys with.
You guys want to do another one? Let's do another. All right, we're just starting to have fun. Now let's do one more. Okay. How likely do you think that it is that a friend or a neighbor would bring you a meal if you were sick? Extremely likely, all the way down to not at all likely.
Ooh, you got 99 votes in. Oh, it's still coming.
Okay,
I like that live number at the top.
All right, whoa, my God.
Wow.
Oh, it's going up further. Wow, you all have great friends and neighbors. I want to live in your neighborhood. This is not a reality for most Americans. Less than half of Americans tell us that someone would bring them a meal if they were sick. And here's the thing. People who trust others are more likely to help others. They're more likely to lend money to a friend in case of an emergency. They're more likely to water their plants, help them out. They're even more likely to conserve water or electricity if asked by public officials to do so. Trust greases the wheels of our daily social interactions. It makes life just a little bit easier for everybody. And people who trust others are also more connected with others. They're more likely to know their neighbors. And get this, they're even more likely to make small talk with people that they don't know. Okay, let's do one last one. How often do you leave your belongings unattended in public places if you need to step away? Oh, okay, everybody's kind of getting
People
this
get
question.
this scenario.
You get this one, right? So say you go to a coffee shop and you take your laptop with you and you get everything set up and then you have to go to the bathroom. It's never happened to me. Okay. This is very interesting. Oh, it's moving. All right. On this question, you are only a little bit different from the US general population. Most Americans say they rarely or never do this. This seems like a small point, but think about the cognitive burden and the anxiety of constantly having to worry about something like this. It's like part of your brain is in fight or flight mode all the time. And that brings me to a larger point. Trust has a variety of personal benefits. People who trust others are also telling us in greater likelihood that they're happier with their lives. They're more satisfied with their family life. They even report better health than those who trust less.
Okay, so this leads us to a question. Where do we go from here? It's an interesting time to be speaking about where we go from here, because we're about 5 years out from a major disorienting event, potentially the most disorienting event in most of our lives, if not in recent American history. The COVID-19 pandemic physically distanced us, as you can see from kind of the iconic circles of people social distancing in parks. But it also emotionally distanced us from one another. We know from our survey data that people think that the COVID-19 pandemic left people ruder in public. I hear murmurs of agreement, yeah. We also know from our data that people think that the COVID-19 pandemic did more to drive us apart as a country than to bring us together, and did more to drive apart even local communities than to bring them together. And it certainly changed the way a lot of us work and live. Many of us are teleworking at greater rates than we ever had in the past. Many of us are interacting via Zoom screens and team boxes and things on our computers more than we did in the past. Some of this is probably bad when it comes to social trust. We're probably interacting with fewer neighbors at the bus stop as we head to work. We're probably interacting with fewer of our coworkers when we go into work. And I know I'm guilty of maybe staying inside for most of a day that I'm teleworking, not even leaving my house, and there's definitely social isolation that can come from that. But it's not all negative. When you're not commuting, maybe you have time to build community in a different way or in a different part of your life than you did before. Maybe those Zoom and Teams boxes that you're tuning into allow you to tune into meetings that weren't live broadcasts before, or to connect with people who live far from you. It's early to know the full impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, but one thing we know for certain from our data is that while trust was falling for a long time, of late, from 2018 on into 2024, trust has actually been relatively flat. It's plateaued. We actually have seen no significant decrease when it comes to the share of Americans who say most people can be trusted from 2018 to 2024 on this particular measure. But because we're the Pew Research Center, we've measured it 3 times and 3 different ways, which is in our report if you're interested, including a new measure that's taken place since the inauguration. And across all 3 of the measures and across these time periods into 2025, we've seen that social trust is flat. Well, what does this mean? It's interesting to think about these data in the context of what our peer organizations are finding in some other countries. The World Values Survey and the European Social Survey, for example, have found that in many high-income countries that we compare ourselves to, for example, the UK, the Netherlands, South Korea, social trust has actually gone up. That's not what we're finding right now. We're finding stability, but we're no longer finding the decline that we once were. We also have some other kind of early indications that maybe things are changing. That long-term religious decline line that I showed you, while certainly religious affiliation has been going down in the United States over the long term, in recent years, it's actually stabilized a bit. We actually do not see the same rates of decline we did before. And we're seeing some data coming from other organizations, like from the US government, about volunteerism, suggesting that post-COVID-19 pandemic, people are volunteering at higher rates than they were in the past.
So trust has declined over time. It is unequally distributed in American society, and it's part and parcel of many other social and political changes that we're also seeing in the country. But despite many shocks to the system, trust also appears to be stabilizing. This is a on the one hand, on the other hand story. And this is where we turn to you. Laura and I have worked with data for quite a while, and we know it well enough by now to be able to say with confidence that data can only outline a story. We rely on you to fill this picture with texture and with color. What do you see when you're out there working with communities? What builds trust? What erodes trust? How do people change their mind? And when you look at this glass of trust that we together behold in our country at this moment, what do you see? Do you see it as half full, or do you see it as half empty? Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Oh, we planned that perfectly. Hi, everyone. We're going to take a little time to explore the data and what it tells us a little bit more. There's also time for you to ask your questions of Laura and Neha. There are 4 microphones placed in the room, 2 in the back of the aisle, 2 closer to the stage. So we'll take a few minutes here and then leave time for your questions. One of the things that really stood out to me in the data is how living near people who are similar to you leads to a more trusting relationship. But we live in a deeply segregated country. So often when we have these conversations, people say we need to talk to one another. But if you're not in community with people who are different from you, whether that's racially or in terms of income or education or political belief, how do we overcome that barrier?
What a great question. It's perhaps the American question. And let me get us started, and perhaps Laura will add something. What we find, most importantly, is sameness is connected with trust, right? And if we are to define trust as what you assume about somebody in the absence of other information, right? Do you assume positive intent or not? Then perceiving diversity, whether that might be through race or ethnicity or other factors, that's a barrier, right? It's a powerful social cue that cues you in that maybe there's a difference here, maybe there isn't sameness here. But the important thing is sameness, right? People, when they perceive sameness, they are more likely to trust, right? But sameness is a perception, and it is not necessarily a reality. So it is possible that people might start perceiving sameness even when they're surrounded by diversity. But that needs to be intentional, right? You must make an effort to find sameness. So in some ways, right, Laura showed this is a newer challenge, right? Our country is diversifying in ways that we haven't experienced before. But I actually don't think it's such a new challenge. It's the same challenge we've always had as a country. It's just different now, right? So currently, we have 14.8% of Americans are immigrants, right? But go back 1890, it was 14.3%. Our challenge has always been to sustain trust in a diverse country and how to see sameness in a country that is this diverse. That is the American experiment.
Well, it also makes me wonder whether the data says anything about whether Americans feel there is a shared identity.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight?
Yeah.
Americans feel less close to other Americans than any other country that we surveyed when we asked about this. So when we asked how close Americans feel to their local community, as well as how close they feel to other Americans, and this was in the context of, I'd say, about 20 countries that we surveyed, we stood out for being the lowest on both of those measures. So they're still relatively high. I think around 6 in 10 said they felt close in some way to either other Americans or their local community. But we kind of stand out when it comes to other countries for being on the less connected, less integrated, less likely to have a shared identity stage. I think it's also interesting in the context of this discussion, we don't have, pride at this point in being American is a partisan issue. Republicans are much more likely to say that they have pride in being American than are Democrats. And so it's difficult in our political context at times to figure out what is sameness.
Yeah. What's at the root of this distrust? I know that's a very complex issue to root out, but I wonder in your research how much you've come to understand about Americans' view of how much of this is a deliberate sowing of mistrust in one another, and how much of it is organic.
Yeah, a few years ago, we ran some focus groups among wide swaths of Americans, and we found that people know we have a problem, right? They can articulate clearly, they feel it in their bones that there is a problem with social trust in our country, and they do seem to blame our politics, right? But I guess this is where, as a researcher, I get a little lost because it's a chicken and egg problem, right? Is our politics reacting to a polarized public, right? And they're just giving back what they see? Or is it the other way, right? I guess what best thing we can say is a little bit of a loop, it's a little bit of a feedback loop. As Democrats and Republicans have just moved further and further apart, right? Our politics has also moved further and further apart. We were not this ideologically consistent in our attitudes in the 90s, right? And that all changed. So is it deliberate or not? It's really hard to say, but what we can say is there's a feedback loop going on between polarized politics and a polarized public and a polarized media environment.
Well, that makes me wonder about young people, because I think the data about this younger generation or generations, it's deeply disturbing to me. And when I talk to young people in my life, they often share this sense that there's not much hope for them to build the kind of life they've been told is possible in this country. How much is their distrust linked to a lack of optimism in around what's possible in the US?
That is a great question. So one thing to note is that young people are less trusting in most countries. So that is not a uniquely American phenomenon. However, it speaks to your other question, which is, there are a lot of countries in which young people don't think they can build the economic life that they once could. When we look at our peer countries in Europe and their politics right now, I think that's a pretty shared concern, right? Can the next generation be better off? We ask that question often, so do other survey organizations. Young people don't think so. They don't think they're going to be able to build a better lives for their children, and they already think that their lives are going to be less kind of economically successful than their parents' generation. But you're exactly right that it is tied up in optimism, but it's tied up in a number of things, because we also see that younger people are more likely to say that they're lonely. Younger people are more likely to say that they are not optimistic about the future writ large, not just when it comes to their own economic successes. And we talked about all of these changes, but young people are feeling some of them probably more unequally than others, and I'd point you towards the social media and internet changes. We all probably remember a time before we were constantly on our phones, so we know what it was like before. A lot of young people don't. And what we're seeing from our work on teens, and we've done a lot of surveys related to teens, and most recently put out work on teens and social media and mental health, is that teens increasingly think that social media is having a negative impact on their generation. And that's changing from just a few years ago. So I think there is something unique about the teenage experience or the young person's experience in being pretty digitally native. And our data also suggests that young people think that COVID had more of a major impact on them. So there has been a lot of change in a relatively shorter lifespan for the youngest generation as well.
When we talk about technology, there's another big tech conversation happening right now around artificial intelligence.
Yes.
And what that means for both our social and economic future here in this country and globally. Neha, when we talk about AI, how do people think about artificial intelligence and what it might mean for whether we grow closer as a country, whether it is another wedge, whether it is something we can look to help us build a stronger economic futures? What do they say?
Yeah. We have been polling on AI more recently, and people's opinions on AI are still forming. But one thing that's very clear, we put out a report on this, I think it was about last month. We asked the public about their perceptions of AI and whether it's going to be good for the United States or bad for the United States and what it'll mean for various jobs. And then we also asked the same questions of AI experts, scientists, people working in the field. There is a big gap between the experts' perceptions of what AI can do for the country and the general public's perception of what AI can do for the country. And you can guess the direction of the gap. The public is much more negative, right? Whereas the experts are much more positive. So when you have a gap like this, anytime you have a gap like this between the elite and the general public, it's concerning, right? It's a recipe for breeding mistrust, for mistrust of elites, for mistrust of institutions. And I think one of the challenges that the AI field will have going into the future is how to bridge this gap. How to take the public along with you, as you're here and the public's here. And they're figuring it out, and they are not trusting right now. So you got to build that trust. You got to take people along with you in this very fast-moving space. There's one more point here that's actually worth making, and that's AI and jobs, right? Both the experts and the public agree that AI is going to change our jobs, right? And certain jobs are kind of ripe for job loss. And they both seem to agree that one of them is journalism, right? One of them is factory workers. Like, these jobs will change and many of them might be lost, right? We know from our research that scarring events like job loss are connected with lower trust. Right? When people lose jobs, they start trusting less. So if there is a revolution coming with job loss related to AI, that's another factor that will add into that mix of mistrust.
Well, it's fascinating. Journalism is one of the places they identify as there being job loss. But then how does that reinforce this distrust in the information landscape? If you don't know where that information is coming from, if there's not a human being to hold accountable when information is shared incorrectly, is this just another feedback loop?
Yeah, I mean, it's already happening. We're seeing the loss in trust in legacy media, right? We've been seeing that and documenting that for a while. At the same time, you're seeing the rise of the influencer. Pew Research Center, the last study we did on this showed that 25% of Americans are relying on influencers for their news, right? So there are these changes that are kind of happening. People realize it, right? They're telling us that they have difficulty telling fact from fiction. At the same time, it's like you're flowing in a river and you can't stop.
One positive note, though, is that people do trust local media at higher rates than they trust national media. People also rely on local media more than they rely on national media. It's definitely the place where many to most Americans get their news. And so when we think about you all out in the community building trust, kind of having the local beat and sharing it with the local community, that remains more trusted than the national media.
Yeah, Orlando Bailey, that points to the work you're doing in Detroit and its importance. I want to invite anyone who has questions right now to come to one of the 4 mics that are placed in the room. Just step up and I will hopefully be able to see you from the stage. Where are the challenges and opportunities right now to strengthen trust in the country? What does the data tell us about that?
Do you want me to take a crack at challenges and opportunities? We showed you that trust is part and parcel of so many other social political changes that are taking place in the country. And there's really 2 ways you can look at that. One way is, oh my God, the best way to fix trust is to fix everything. Right? Fix education, fix neighborhoods, fix our politics, fix religion, fix it all and you'll fix trust, right? That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is there is so much swimming in the water, you could get in anywhere. Right? You could get in at the neighborhood level. We know that's connected with trust. You could get in at religious congregations level. We know that is connected with trust. You could get in with news. That's connected with trust. There are so many nodes, and there are so many entry points. So on the one hand, it's a little overwhelming. Oh my God, how do I fix trust? On the other hand, start anywhere. Right? And that could make a difference. That could fix trust somewhere.
Well, let's take some questions right here.
What does the research say about the connection, if there is one, between increasing wealth inequality and decline in social trust?
It's a great question. We know that when people think that institutions are unequal, when they think that the rich have too much power, which most Americans do think currently, this is related to less trust. And so as America has grown more unequal, there's a strong possible relationship between declining social trust. It's this idea that the them have something that you don't and that they're taking advantage of you. And we've measured this in a number of different ways, but that general sense that some people are getting more than their fair share of the pie is related to the sense that most people can't be trusted.
In the report, we do have a section on this that shows the extent to which income inequality has increased in the United States. It's a very neat chart that you look at the chart, you know exactly what's going on. The one line goes up, the other line goes down, and you can guess which way those lines are going.
Let's take a question in the back. Yes.
Hi, thanks. My name's Tim Sarantonio. I'm Director of Community Engagement at Neon One and also chair of the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. My question is actually concerned with parallel research that we've been doing at FEP, because we look at individual giving to nonprofits, and so it's the most comprehensive benchmarking research on individual giving. So we found in our most recent study in our Q4 report of 2024 giving that 96.9% of folks in America are giving under $5,000 a year. The narrative is typically dollars up, donors down, because the average everyday donor doesn't feel connected to things. So I'd be interested, especially in your research around the connections between generosity behavior, and especially what was intriguing was the volunteer mention, any correlations between trust and generosity in what you've found. Thank you.
Yeah, we actually have a question in the report that you'll be able to see about whether or not people have donated in the last year. And we find that social trusters, people who say most people can be trusted, are significantly more likely to have donated money. We looked at that kind of through the lens of trust, but there are also other correlates of giving that we see. Obviously, it's related to income, education, and a number of other demographic factors. But yes, our data bear out the idea that social trust is related to charitable giving for certain.
And just really quickly, I'd like to pause. I don't know if it's possible to get Laura a handheld mic. Her mic is cutting out a bit, so I want to make sure everyone hears what she has to say, but we'll press ahead. Right here?
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for that presentation. I'm Anj Marie Hancock, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Ohio State. And I had a question. I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into the differences. You talked about some inequality-based differences for why there might be people who trust less. And you talked a little bit about, from an economic or rational, kind of perspective, folks who are making less money, have less income, have less education, have less margin, right, to be able to fix a mistake in trust. And I wanted to delve a little deeper and see if there were any additional explanations. And I was thinking specifically about the idea that not having trust can often be a rational response, right? So when you think about the racial differences that might exist, or you think about what Orlando was talking about earlier, and people thinking it's a scam, of course, if you've been scammed in the past. So I wanted to ask both, are there explanations or do you have data that would talk about past experiences or trust in different institutions and whether or not that would be correlated, and really thinking about how institutions might also be responsible for rebuilding the trust as opposed to just thinking there's a flaw in us as individuals needing to be more trusting?
Yeah. What a great question. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, social trust is a social good, but lack of trust is sometimes the most appropriate and rational response to a given situation. I mean, we will be releasing the results of a study we're doing on internet scams, right? I think it's going to come out maybe next month or soon after that, and we're going to be looking at older adults who we know are more trusting and falling for scams, right? Not opening the door when somebody knocks is a perfectly rational response if you live in a neighborhood where your experience tells you don't open the door. So what is the ideal level of trust in a society, right? It's probably not 100%. Right? There's some level of mistrust that is actually a good thing. At the same time, we know that trust is connected with a variety of benefits, social benefits, personal benefits. So while trust is unequally distributed in society, and while it may be a perfectly rational response in a given situation, it does have a lot of benefits, right? So for it to be falling the way it's falling, and for it to be this unequally distributed, particularly by race, right? That is what gives us considerable pause as a country.
This middle mic, yes. Right there, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for a really engaging and thoughtful presentation. I was really struck by the data around the increasing diversity of America, and yet the seemingly stabilization of trust. And I was wondering, how exactly is this happening? What is the mechanism? And I began to wonder if it was actually segregation, right? So something that has negative connotations typically if our immediate neighborhoods are very homogeneous and segregated. Is that actually a protective factor when it comes to trust, which is kind of striking and jarring and weird at the same time. So I just wanted to pick your brains on that.
I'll get going on this, and then maybe Laura can add on. I mean, I think one thing, Laura and I had several discussions about this. We're starting to see some stabilization, right, in trust, but we don't want to overstate this. We were kind of like, are we really doing a happy dance in front of a burning house? We don't want to leave people with the wrong impression, right? Oh, it's hope. We're seeing some early evidence, okay, that trust is stabilizing. It could be a COVID effect, right? Our country just went through something traumatic, and we know trust tends to rise, right, after traumatic events that happened after 9/11. This particular event did pull people apart physically and emotionally, so maybe that's why you're seeing not a rise but a stabilization. But there are generational differences in trust. Right? So I'm not going to bet on the future, but if I had to, right, unless younger generations change their mind, unless something changes in the way younger people think, that generational replacement is going to catch up with us. Right? Are we going to see that stabilization into the future? I don't know. That generational difference is really stuck in my craw right now.
Well, just to follow up to that though, Neha, does the data tell us whether young people think about community in the same way? And I'm thinking about social media and the internet. It puts them in contact with people globally in a way that we didn't experience.
Great question. We've never asked directly, but if I had to kind of connect those dots, I mean, younger people at higher rates are telling us they're online almost constantly. Black and Latino youth are online almost constantly at higher rates than white youth. So they have got to be changing the way they think about community. Right? Maybe it's less about face-to-face.
That same question I mentioned about how close we feel to people around us and how close we feel to Americans.
Oh, pause for 1 second, Laura. Let's get you another mic.
Perfect. Do I need to?
This one? Okay. We also asked how close people feel to people all over the world, and younger people are slightly more likely to say they feel close to people all over the world. That's the case both in the US and internationally. So there may be a little bit more of a global community feeling that comes from being online almost constantly and interacting with difference, whether it be local difference, nationwide difference, or even international difference.
We have time for about 3 more questions quickly in the back microphone.
Would I be able to actually throw it to them on that side because they haven't had a chance to yet?
Oh, it's kind of hard to see all of them.
That's all right.
Well then let's come here. Yeah, thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
no.
Go ahead.
Such
That
a
is very
trusting-
kind of you.
Building trust.
I want to yield. Yeah, thank you. Great example. I want to yield back my time, but I've got the mic now, so I'm going to take it. Thank you very much. My name's Keith Daly. I'm with the Kroger Company. I'm also here as a guest of the CEO of the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, where I serve on the board. And I've come across research, not Pew Research. It actually came from Brunswick Group, based here in Chicago, about the rise of super distrusters in the United States. So what they found is 1/4 of the population are super distrusters, which I'm oversimplifying, but essentially they distrust any institution, government, business, leaders, CEOs, elected officials, you name it. And I'm curious, one, if you're familiar with that, if you have a point of view on it, but it makes me wonder, is the intensity of distrust perhaps part of the challenge today? And if there might be correlation or causation between that idea and some of your findings.
Yeah. It's almost tautological, but in my mind, it's quite interesting. Truster is going to trust, right? Distruster is going to distrust. So people who don't trust, institutional mistrust and social trust is tied together. People will even articulate that for you. A few months ago, we ran some focus groups among low trust individuals. And what I was really struck by from that discussion was people were telling us, if there's an institution behind what you're hearing, then don't trust it. Right? So they were saying this in relation to the news media. You might be interested in this. They were telling us that journalists are not doing research. Right? They are not out there talking to people and gathering data and then telling you what the story really is. If a journalist is working for an institution, NPR, CBS, whatever it might be, they are reading from a script of what the institution wants them to read. And that is all they're doing. All institutions have an agenda. So if there's an institution behind it, don't trust it. So that's the complete opposite, right? Don't trust institutions, don't trust experts, don't trust, and then that translates to don't trust each other. So what you're calling super trusters, I say, okay, distruster is going to distrust, truster is going to trust, right? So, but I'd be really interested in what you're finding in this other research that you're citing.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. However, we have lots of time across the day for you to connect with Neha and Laura and learn more about their research. You can find the research online. It's live now. And of course, we have the longest table lunch. So lots of opportunities for you to connect with them. Just as we wrap up here, just one question you'd like us to ask ourselves as we go about the day and engage with one another.
I think we'd be curious what resonates with you. How does this fit with your experience building trust? How does it look similar or different? Because we'd like to hear from you. It helps us inform our research going forward. Yeah. And if I can make one quick plug, our report is now at pewresearch.org/social trust. So hopefully easy for you to find if you didn't get the QR code before.
My challenge as a researcher, but perhaps this is your challenge as well, is when it comes to some of the diversity numbers and the changing face of America and how that's tied with trust, what we find is people constantly tend to overestimate the demographic change. Right? It's happening so fast that they feel it in their bones very intensely. And when you ask them, say in Europe, we've asked people, what share of the population do you think is Muslim? And they will guess like double or triple the number that's actually true, right? There was one study where the survey researcher asked Republicans what share of Democrats are LGBTQ, and they said like 40%, right? It's nowhere close to that. But these perceptions are coming from a place of fear, right? And when you encounter fear and you encounter misperception, the best thing you can do is shine the light of transparency. Right? These are the numbers. That's why we gave you the numbers. Right? These are the authoritative numbers of how the country is changing demographically. This deserves an honest discussion. We know from the research that sameness is tied to trust and what the challenge of this country is going forward. This deserves an honest conversation.
Laura, Neha, thank you so much.